Are you a professional, a doctor, a lawyer, an entrepreneur, and you're struggling with depression? Do so many people rely on you, but you feel like you're about to burst into tears at any moment?
So, you have postpartum depression?
No, I have the weepies.
No, baby, you got postpartum.
You have no lines in this play.
Okay.
Jordan, I can handle it.
Really? What do you got there in your hand?
A job application for the Gap.
Oh, that's a good career move.
Look. All I ever wanted was to be a mother. And now that I am one, I feel like I'm not cut out for it.
And you're ashamed of that?
Well, wouldn't you be?
Yeah, I was. What's the worst feeling you've had since you had the baby?
I don't know.
When Jack wouldn't stop crying, I wanted to throw that bastard out the window.
Really? I wanted to throw Isabella out the window. Yeah, but we just had our apartment repainted and all the windows were sealed shut. So I just wanted to drop her off the roof.
Listen, you can't get rid of this by sheer force of will or positive thinking or taking advice from a big Hollywood movie star and the dead science fiction writer he worships. You need to get some help.
Okay.
Many people like Carla from Scrubs avoid their symptoms, deny their symptoms. And what ends up happening is a terrible ripple effect of consequences. Whether you're suffering from postpartum depression or major depressive disorder or any other mood disorder, you're going to benefit from watching this video because I will dive into the 3 mistakes that professionals with depression make, what you need to avoid, what the threats are, and how to combat those symptoms. So stay tuned. So the first mistake that professionals with depression make is they deny their symptoms. Nancy McWilliams, a psychoanalyst, identified that denial is actually a dissociative phenomenon that was rooted in an evolutionary way of coping with mourning. So what does that really mean for us? Well, that means that a piece of our psyche is essentially broken off and buried within the unconscious. And we do this as a way to cope, and we've been doing it for a very long time. Denying your symptoms, your emotions, your thoughts, your past experiences can have a devastating ripple effect, like I said with Carla, because nothing actually stays buried in the unconscious. We can only deny it for so long. One way that denied thoughts, feelings, and past experiences can resurface is through intrusive thoughts. For example, Carla was struggling with postpartum depression, which means that she was essentially experiencing, if you watch the episode and you watch until the end, that she was experiencing intrusive thoughts surrounding her newborn daughter, as well as trying to navigate motherhood and being sleep deprived, as well as being away from the hospital, not being a nurse, and what that means while she was on maternity leave. And all this came collapsing down, but all of this is denied by Carla. And thank goodness for Jordan when she comes in as a friend and bluntly lays everything out on the table and said, so you have postpartum depression. And what Carla does is minimize. She says, no, I have the weepies. People deny what is going on for many different reasons, but it is not helpful. It keeps you stuck. And if you're in a position to unconsciously continue deny and bury what is going on, your stressors, your thoughts, your feelings, all this negativity, then you're going to experience unfortunate repercussions because, again, what is under the unconscious will eventually penetrate the conscious mind. One way to combat the effects of denial is to attack it head on. One way to deal with this is to focus on what happens to the psyche, which means that when a piece of the psyche is denied, there is a split that is created. And one part of the psyche can actually be fed this negativity, these thoughts of inferiority or just general negativity. And what happens is these thoughts and feelings associated with these thoughts can be intensified. The more in which we remember painful things that happened in the past, we tend to associate this with evidence to suggest that maybe we're not good enough or we don't have intrinsic value. And what ends up happening is that stressors in the present add on to that evidence to suggest that we're even worse, that maybe we can't do things. So this cycle tends to feed itself. The part of your psyche here is stuck on a negative feedback loop where it just continues feeding this negative self-fulfilling prophecy, in which case you can't succeed. Or worse, you feel as though that emotionally you can't survive. Or sometimes if you're experiencing suicidal thoughts, you might feel like you can't survive. But that's not the whole story. What actually is the whole story is that there's another part of the psyche that it's important to remember, and that's the resilient part. Because let's face it, if you are in a position of being a professional and you are managing your career life, or at least trying to, and you're in a position of managing your home life, your family life, maybe you're still in school, you're also trying to manage maybe hobbies and you have other commitments, as well as self-care. And on top of all of this, you're in a position to try to cope with your life stressors and balance your day-to-day as best as you can. My goodness, that is resiliency. That shows mental strength. By you even watching this video, you're in a position of feeding that resilient part of your psyche, because this means that you're driven to change. And this part of your psyche in this moment is acting now towards that change, that you are valuable, that you do deserve your goals and achieving those goals, and you can meet them. The threat here with this particular split is that sometimes the negative part of the psyche can take over. And even though that you're resilient, and even though that this part of the psyche might be much bigger, there's still a part that can get in the way. And that's really the threat here with this particular denial piece when things are split. So you're probably asking, what do you do now? Well, it's going to be helpful for you to bridge the gap between these two parts of the psyche. So this way these two parts can communicate. So you're not in a position of feeling so bombarded and so overwhelmed that you're able to react rather than respond. And remember this other part of you, this resilient part. So for instance, that might look like, well, you might be in a position of experiencing a negative dynamic with your boss. You might feel as though that you're inferior. You might feel as though that you didn't perform well. But then you remember the other side of your psyche. That maybe just last week, your boss gave you a glowing evaluation. Maybe you're in a position of getting a raise. So you forgot in that moment that you are actually performing really well, and you might have made a mistake, or you might have been so tired that you didn't perform well on a particular project. Be mindful of what is going on to bridge these two parts. Yes, I might feel as though that I've underperformed. I might feel inferior in this moment, but I also remember the other part of myself, the resilient part, the part that isn't an imposter, and the part that feels that I can perform and I can actually do well. That's an example of how we can bridge the gap. Because what ends up happening is if we don't bridge the gap and these two islands essentially remain distant from each other, then what's going to happen is you're either going to access this island and you're going to be flooded with negativity, or you're going to be in a position of accessing this part of your island being, let's say, blindly resilient, where nothing can really penetrate you or stress you out, in which case you are going to be very vulnerable at both ends. So bridging the gap allows you to strengthen your psyche and allows you to really combat that denial. So this way you can process the pain that's underneath. Okay, so the next mistake that professionals with depression make has to do with minimizing their issues and believing that they can handle it on their own. It is not uncommon for professionals like Carla in the clip, who really thought that she can either manage her issues on her own when she was minimizing, or thought there weren't any issues at all to manage. So she was in a position of being very vulnerable and being exposed and unfortunately spiraling. Other people might avoid accessing treatment for other reasons, which might include a stigma about medication. Maybe they feel as though that medication isn't appropriate, that they should be in a position to tackle their problems on their own. But that's not necessarily the case if there's a chemical imbalance. So if there's an irregulation of serotonin, let's say in the limbic system, then antidepressants like SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, will help with this imbalance and help someone feel better. Or there might be a stigma associated with therapy. That therapy are for individuals who are supposedly weak-minded, or for individuals who are in a position of being crazy or need crisis support, when that's just not the case. Or there's also this fantasy that it might hinder their career path. The reality of the situation is that if you struggle with clinical depression, then treatment is required by a professional or sometimes a group of professionals, like a psychiatrist and a therapist. And this is similar to the physical component as well. So for instance, if you're in a position where you fell and you broke your ankle, you require a professional's support. You might need a surgeon, you definitely need a doctor, but you can't do it on your own. Whether you're in a position of taking medication and or attending therapy, both actually can be really helpful. Based on research, there has been a significant amount of research that suggests the combination of medication, again, if you need it, and therapy can really benefit you and can really help you move from point A to point B in terms of feeling a little bit more regulated and feeling as though that you can respond to your stressful environment if you have a very stressful environment rather than be reactive. You will actually be more in control of what is going on during situations where it's seemingly out of control. It is also important to note that if you are taking medication, please take your medication as prescribed by your family doctor, and also please avoid all psychoactive substance use, any recreational use, because whether you are using, let's say, a glass of wine, maybe at lunch every single day, this can really impact your medication, and this can really impact your overall state of well-being. So even though you're not in a position, let's say, of being dependent on the alcohol, you're just maybe in a position of enjoying a glass of wine at lunch every day, well, it's still going to be impactful, even though that there isn't a substance use issue, because what ends up happening is that the neurotransmitters in your brain are impacted. So the natural production of neurotransmitters, like we spoke about serotonin, can be impacted. And if the natural production of neurotransmitters is impacted, then what's going to end up happening is you're going to experience through the withdrawal, when the body metabolizes a substance out of your body, you're going to experience a come down. And with people who, let's say, drink, they're going to experience a depressive state when they are metabolizing or, in a sense, withdrawing from their substance. So this can really impact the person on an emotional level in that regard, and this can also really hinder the effects of medication, because if you're in a position to try to regulate a chemical imbalance and then you're introducing psychoactive substances to dysregulate what is going on in the brain, well, then it really defeats the whole purpose. So be aware of what you are using and how it can impact your medication use. And please contact your family doctor and have a conversation with your family doctor. If you do use recreationally, or if you have a substance dependency issue, have a conversation with your family physician who can help you identify what an appropriate treatment path would be with regards to medication. And then simultaneously work with your therapist and your family physician to help establish a treatment plan that can help you if you are struggling with substance abuse issues, that can help you with your depression and substance abuse. Okay, so the threat here when professionals minimize or avoid treatment at all costs because they believe that they can handle it on their own or there isn't an issue really leaves someone vulnerable. You are in a position of being left vulnerable. And you don't have to continue to feed that negative feedback loop. You don't have to feel as though that you're not good enough. You can be in a position to feel as though that you are excelling, to really grow that resilient part of your psyche. The big threat here with professionals who tend to minimize their substances and avoid treatment at all costs, believe that they can manage on their own, tend to be in a very difficult position because their symptoms are going to worsen and worsen and worsen. they're not going to be in a position to actually move forward because they require treatment. They require treatment from a professional. So what happens is they don't seek treatment, or treatment is sought when they're in crisis and when everything is coming down and crashing down. One way really to combat this particular threat, this threat of minimization and this threat feeling that professionals like you can do this on your own, really has to do with looking at your ego. Yes, our ego can get in the way. And what can happen is that if we're in a position, let's say maybe you're a family physician, or maybe you're a psychiatrist, and you feel as though that you should know what to do, and you were in a position of helping countless patients with depression, so you don't need support from outside resources, you're able to manage it, or the depressive symptoms aren't too bad, and therefore you can manage it on your own, really causes you to be stuck and really limits you, because you're not going to be able to see certain things about maybe your behavior that other people might see. You might not be able to see how you're showing up in the world. You might not be able to see, let's say, the impact you have with your patients, whether it's positive or negative. You might not be in a position to be able to gather all of this data. And this is why it is so helpful to have other supports and other resources like a psychiatrist, like a therapist, because they can be observant and they can tell you what's going on. Hey, did you notice that you're in a position of really attacking yourself and saying that you made this huge mistake and that you're such an awful person? But at the same time, you spoke about how you're excited that you're getting this promotion. How is it that these two sides are talking? Again, the split. You might have not been aware of that. And by going to therapy allows you to build that insight. So sometimes we have to set our ego aside and just jump in and approach the situation like we don't know, because we don't know what we don't know. The next mistake professionals make is the ability to relinquish control. For instance, attending therapy can be a very vulnerable experience, especially if you're approaching or you're in a position of engaging in a psychoanalytic treatment, that you will be possibly lying down on the couch and you're letting your mind wander. Whatever comes to the surface comes to the surface. If it's about your childhood past, it's about your childhood past, or the weather, or that mean kid from the first grade. Whatever comes up, comes up. And this is something that is very difficult for people. And this could be very overwhelming, especially when you're in a position of not only connecting with whatever's coming up in the surface, but also being in a position to articulate what is happening. Because sometimes people feel as though that their fantasies, what they're thinking about, what they're feeling, they're not in a position to actually bring it to the therapist. So as an example, you might have an aggressive fantasy, and you might have gotten into a fight with your boss, an argument with your boss, and you really just wanted to shove your boss, or you really just wanted to punch your boss in the face. And this is your fantasy. Clearly, you know the line. So if you're in a position of behaving aggressively, then that's a criminal act, that's unethical, that goes against the law. But fantasizing about this doesn't, because it remains in the mind. But sometimes people find it so difficult to experience those aggressive fantasies and to tell someone about those aggressive fantasies, out of maybe fear how they would view that particular person. So it's very overwhelming in that regard. Or in opposition with people, let's say, who struggle with depression and they feel as though that their emotional load is too much. They might not want to burden the therapist. And that's their fantasy, as if their emotional load will burden the therapist and will somehow hurt the therapist. And the therapist will no longer want to have that therapeutic relationship and refer the patient elsewhere. The threat here is not that people aren't in a position of attending therapy, because professionals here in this sense are attending therapy. But what the threat is that they're not honest with themselves and they're not honest with their therapist. And being honest with yourself and being honest with your therapist allows the treatment to go further, Because if you're safeguarding or if you're in a position of constricting what you have to say, what you think, what you feel, then you're only really hindering your own progress. Especially within a psychoanalytic treatment, it is so important to get the details of what is going on in the psyche in order to understand the unconscious workings of the mind. So a big threat here is control. If you're not in a position to relinquish control and to build control, then it's going to be difficult for you to function in a situation where control is out the window. So one way to combat relinquishing control has to do with giving up control just little by little. We're not asking too much here, just a little bit at a time. And this will really help you to see what it feels like to not be in control and to cope with that feeling of not being in control. So for instance, you can gently challenge yourself going into session, and you might think to yourself, okay, I have this aggressive fantasy, or I have these really heavy emotions and I don't want to articulate it. Validate it, but gently challenge yourself to articulate it and see what happens to you. Was it as bad as you thought? Or maybe you got the support that you needed and that you were actually looking for. So something different can happen. If you're not in a position of attending therapy for whatever reason, or you're on a wait list, then it's going to be important while you're preparing, hopefully, to go to therapy, that you're going to be in a position to journal. Journaling can be helpful, but it's not just journaling how you think or what you think rather, or how you feel, or what's happened in your past or what's happening now, but it's really going into depth, diving into the unconscious mind, as if maybe you're writing a book or painting a picture with your words. We want to know what is going on in the psyche, what is going on in your mind. So you might talk about how you were in a situation where you felt that you experienced a complete loss of control, and this was very overwhelming for you. Then it's going to be important. Again, I typically say it's going to be important because it is going to be important if you're in a position to analyze and to dive into what the control factor is. Why do I need to be in control? What happens if I'm not in control? Is there someone that I'm trying to impress, or is there something I'm trying to prove? Do I fear something terrible will happen if I'm not in control? Or maybe you feel that you're the one that everybody relies on and that you have to be the rock. You have to be in control. Tell me what that's about. Tell yourself what that's about. Write in your journal. This will help prepare you not only to be comfortable with your own mind and diving into the depths of your own mind and understanding the details of your own mind, but it's also going to be important for you to feel comfortable to maybe explore that with someone. So when you do get to the point of attending therapy, then you're in a position of feeling a little bit more comfortable. You're still going to build the therapeutic alliance. You're still building that relationship, but you're in a position of really working now towards more of the analysis rather than trying to feel comfortable about how you express yourself. Okay, so in this video, we talked about the 3 mistakes that professionals with depression make that you need to avoid. We spoke about the threats, and we spoke about what you need to do in order to combat those threats. I know that you are saddened that this video is now coming to an end, but rest assured that I will be back with more insightful content focusing on mental health, psychoeducation, and helping new therapists with strategies, insights, and research information. We upload videos every Wednesday, so be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so this way you don't miss out. In the meantime, be sure to watch this next video where I focus on seasonal affective disorder. I want to thank you so much for watching this video and supporting this channel, and I will see you in this video next.